Welcome to the last section of Module 3, which is actually Section 6, entitled Outsourced Production and Omni-Channel Distribution, Build-to-Order Models. Many overseas vendors, the manufacturers that we will buy our finished goods from, they operate a build-to-order model. This is very important that U.S. importers realize this. Most vendors overseas, especially in Asia, do not have inventory laying around waiting to fill orders. From a timing perspective, this is very, very important. This model implies that suppliers only engage in their own manufacturing planning and control activities when they receive an order from a U.S. importer. We know what those MP and C activities are, as we see here: master production scheduling, MRP, capacity planning. The only time specific to the products that we buy from overseas vendors that they're going to engage in this activity is when we place an order on them. To say it one more time, most vendors overseas don't have inventory laying around. These build-to-order models normally imply that a U.S. importer provides a down payment upon placing a purchase order. Of course, super large importers don't necessarily have to put a down payment on a purchase order with an overseas vendor. In many cases, other U.S. importers do have to do just that. In China, for example, not unusual for a vendor to ask for a 30% down payment when a purchase order is placed on them. Oftentimes, the reason why they're asking for a down payment is so that overseas supplier can go out and purchase raw materials. It's a build-to-order model. So not only is the vendor not going to have finished goods laying around, they're not going to have a lot of raw materials laying around either. The importer places an order, that's when the bell rings and the game begins. Continuing on with this down payment idea, oftentimes the vendor will also require another down payment, or even the entire balance, when goods are delivered to a designated freight forwarder at origin. We place an order on a vendor. We give them 30%. It's a 90-day production lead time. 90 days goes by, they deliver to our freight forwarder in Jakarta, Indonesia. That freight forwarder, upon receiving the goods, is going to issue what's referred to as a forwarder's cargo receipt, an FCR. Super important document in the import world. When the vendor has that document, it's proof of delivery. That's going to trigger that additional payment. We'll talk more about that when we get into inbound logistics several modules down the road. Needless to say, when a U.S. importer buys finished goods from vendors, a great deal of coordination is required. This whole decoupling of the buy side from the sell side and then taking every measure possible to couple it back together. In other words, the integration of buy side and sell side activities. Typically, in a build-to-order model, it is the responsibility of the U.S. buyer to provide a bill of material to the vendor that specifies what are the ingredients in the recipe, to use our previous analogy from previous modules. What is the recipe for a given product? What raw materials go into it? What level of quality do we need? Typically, the importer will provide or at least participate in the preparation of a bill of material. Of course, the timing of product quality and/or compliance testing is also critical. This is especially so when dealing with children's products, cosmetics that are subject to the Food and Drug Administration here in the U.S. We're not talking about product testing when goods get to the United States. We're talking about product testing and product quality assurance before goods ever leave the country of origin. Again, children's products, cosmetics, certainly foodstuffs. When dealing with several partner government agencies in the United States, flammability, lead content, choke hazard, these things all have to be taken care of, especially in a build-to-order model, because there isn't a lot of time to go from testing to actual production, due mainly to the fact that these overseas vendors, as we've said a couple of times now, they don't have finished goods laying around to sell to a U.S. importer. That's just not the way they work. Couple of points, kind of summarizing much of what we've spoken of already. The importer in the U.S. is still going to have to operate off of a forecast. That importer needs a baseline from which to operate. Because of variation in the supply chain, it is likely that the U.S. importer will carry some level of finished goods inventory. It's a risky proposition to be importing finished goods and relying on the integrity of the inbound supply chain and not carry finished goods inventory. Something around to fill a customer order, to replenish our retail stores, to meet a web sale. In such a high variability environment as an inbound supply chain, it is likely that the U.S. importer of finished goods will carry some level of finished goods inventory. The goal is to find ways to reduce variability in the supply chain that reduces the need to carry so much inventory, and hopefully will drive down the need to carry safety stock to cover all of these supply chain variances. As we've said a number of times, consuming the forecast should also be used. It is dangerous not to. It is dangerous to use a forecast for the whole year and never change it once based on actual demand activity. That's a bad practice, not a best practice. Fourth point here is the alignment of vendor cumulative lead times with lead times for customer orders. That's just critical. We've talked about cumulative lead times a bunch of times now. We're not going to define it anymore. But if we have customer orders to fill in 90 days, and the cumulative lead time from a build to order vendor overseas is 120 days, we have a problem. We'll talk more about that as we align inbound purchases with the timing thereof. We'll see more and more of that when we get into our logistics modules. A quick supply chain perspective: overseas offices and trading companies. Regardless of the import model, coordination with overseas vendors is a complicated affair, with considerations like language barriers, time differences, quality issues, documentation problems, and less than optimal technology links. U.S. importers are essentially running a 24/7, 365 business. Depending on the size of the business and expansiveness of the supplier base, some U.S. importers choose to open administrative offices in close proximity to vendor clusters. Many U.S. companies operate offices to deal with the above issues, including the employment of production engineers that visit vendor plants. That's not unusual at all. A good example of this is when U.S. importers have offices in Hong Kong or Shenzhen in South China that are responsible for all supplier relationship management functions. That's not unusual at all. Actually having employees of a U.S. importer in Hong Kong, or other places too, that go out and work with the vendors directly. Engineers, quality people, product testing people. That's quite common. Conversely, some U.S. importers use trading companies to conduct the above functions on their behalf. While this model may be less expensive, or at least based on a variable cost model, the downside is that the U.S. importer may not know who the actual manufacturer of their products is. Let's wrap up this section and this module with an introduction to sales and operations planning. We'll see more of it in the future. This is an introduction. Here's a definition developed in July of 2018. Sales and operations planning is a multi-departmental business discipline that allows companies to synchronize product supply with customer demand. Hopefully that all sounds very familiar because it's basically a definition of supply chain management. Designed as a permanent, ongoing activity, S&OP uses updated forecasts to convert high-level supply chain strategies into operational activities that include master production scheduling, MRP, capacity planning, inventory management, purchasing order management, logistics, and accounting. Whether we outsource production for finished goods or we are a manufacturer ourselves that brings in raw materials for production, we have to engage in sales and operations planning. Why? Because essentially, sales and operations planning forces executives to constantly compare period-specific product forecasts with actual sales activities. That better sound familiar. And then make operational adjustments that reflect any variation between the two, the essence of supply chain management. Whereas the specifics of the sales and operations planning function may vary by industry and company, S&OP is essential to making sure that an organization can achieve a balance between demand, inventories, and profitability. Pretty important stuff. Some of the activities associated with S&OP, again, depending on the model. Definitely sales forecasting, regardless of model. Master production scheduling, as a manufacturer ourselves, or as in the case of this module, an outsourced model for finished goods. MRP, sourcing strategies, purchasing policies, supplier relationship management, all has to be conducted. distribution requirements planning. That is getting finished goods out into our distribution network in the United States and how we manage customer relationships. Inventory management, you could argue, is the essence of sales and operations planning, because what S&OP comes down to is balancing supply with demand, much like supply chain management. And naturally, demand management too. Not only forecasting, but available to promise and the actual customer orders that are going to do what? Consume our forecast. Whether we manufacture ourselves or outsource manufacturing, S&OP has to take place. It's just a matter of who conducts these activities and how do we manage them. Why do we even engage in S&OP? What are the objectives and outcomes? Of course, we want to link high-level strategies with tactical execution. How are we doing in marketing? Are our marketing efforts paying off? What's going on in production, whether we produce ourselves or outsource? And how do we finance all of these activities? Because S&OP is nice, but if we can't finance the adjustments that we're making in our supply chain based on S&OP activities, there's going to be a problem. Of course, the main objective is greater alignment between the buy side and the sell side of the supply chain, SRM and CRM. And in our decoupled example of outsourced manufacturing of finished goods that we as a U.S. importer will bring into the country, S&OP is only going to support all of the other ongoing activities that we engage in. Everything that we've talked about can be supported and augmented through a formal sales and operations planning program. An important point to make is that S&OP, because it's so intentional, it's so permanent and ongoing, is that over time, we as the U.S. importer of finished goods, for example, we're going to have enhanced sensitivity to the many demand signals we see in our omni-channel distribution model, from point of sales to web sales to institutional sales to exports. Hopefully over time, because we're learning and applying what we learn, our forecasts will become more accurate. Never perfect, but more accurate, because they're based on demand-based adjustments. Not just what we sell, but actual demand. The orders we couldn't fill, the orders that got backlogged, and the orders that got ultimately canceled. Hopefully, with S&OP, because we're doing it all the time, we have a faster response to purchasing adjustments. S&OP tells us that a given item is selling faster than we thought. Can we get more in? Conversely, S&OP tells us that a given item is selling less than what we thought. Can we put the brakes on purchase orders? Or, to put it in more common terms, can we change things on the fly? Without S&OP to augment our ongoing activities, those changes on the fly become A, more difficult to identify, and B, more difficult to execute upon. If we're making adjustments, getting product when we need it, backing off product when we don't, hopefully our sales will improve. The first of the 4 goals of supply chain that we spoke of so many modules ago: maximize our revenue through existing product sales and new product launches, or NPIs, new product introductions. We want to gain greater control over product-specific landed cost and profit margin, because we know what's going on every month with specific items. And as we've said, tighter inventory management. We don't lose sales, but we don't get stuck with obsolete inventory. One can see that the objectives of sales and operations planning are consistent, if not identical, with tactical supply chain management. The ability to bring S&OP to the table in support of those tactical activities is only going to work to the benefit of the organization. All right. Well, that's it for Module 3. And as we saw at the very front of the module, we had 4 objectives. You can decide if we achieve them. We talked a lot about omni-channel distribution and its impact on demand management. We indeed analyzed demand management within the framework of outsourced production. That's what this whole module was about, and what that means to third-party manufacturing planning and control, and the decoupling of the buy side of supply chain from the sell side, and what we need to do as the U.S. importer to bring them back together. From there, identify the links between demand management and a U.S. import program, and finally, an introduction to the concepts of sales and operations planning, which will appear again in much greater detail. That's it for Module 3. Please do come back for Module 4, where we have a deep dive on global sourcing. We'll see you soon.